This is a free lecture for global business economics on the aggregate production function. One of our main tasks in economics is to explain the overall level of GDP in an economy. Real GDP, as we know, measures the amount of economic activity that takes place. Broadly speaking, there are two approaches to explaining the level of GDP. We can look at the supply side, ask how much is produced, or we can look at the demand side and ask how much is demanded. The aggregate production function looks at real GDP from the supply side. The underlying idea is that we have some inputs, which we're thinking now as being inputs for the economy as a whole. These inputs are labor hours, physical capital, human capital, knowledge, natural resources, and something we call social infrastructure. And we take these inputs, we pass them through some kind of a black box, which we call an aggregate production function, and the end result is we produce real GDP. So if we can explain why these different inputs will change over time, then we can also explain changes in real GDP. One feature of the aggregate production function that we think is realistic is that, particularly when we think about physical capital and labor hours, the production function is going to display diminishing marginal product. What we mean by that is that if, for example, we hold everything else fixed but add more and more physical capital to the production process, we will get more output but at a diminishing rate. Similarly, if we add more and more labor to the production process, we'll get more output at a diminishing rate. Think about it in terms of having, say, a production facility with a given amount of capital, a given amount of machinery in it. As you add more workers to that production process, you will get more output, but after a while you're not going to get much additional advantage by employing more and more workers. So let's think about these inputs in turn. Let's first think about what determines the amount of labor in an economy. Well, there are three things that we can point to. One is the labor market. In other words, we look at domestic supply and demand for labor. And in the long run, these are going to be affected also by participation rates. For example, one of the forces that's affected the amount of labor in developed economies over the last several decades has been increased female participation in the labor force. The second thing that we can look at is population growth. Over long periods of time, that can be important for affecting the total amount of labor in an economy. And the third is migration, and in particular, international migration. And migration tends to equalize wages. So our underlying story here is just a competitive labor market. The labor market may not be truly competitive, but for the kind of analysis we need to do here, it's good enough just to think in terms of a competitive market. So imagine we've got two economies. One of them is relatively labor abundant, so it's got a lot of labor supply relative to demand. In that economy, wages are going to be relatively low. The real wage will be relatively low. And in the other economy, let's suppose that labor supply is much more restricted, so real wages are high. If workers are free to move between these two economies, then what we would expect to see is that workers would migrate out of the low-wage economy. That would decrease labor supply in that economy and cause real wages to go up. These workers, of course, would be going somewhere. They would be going to the high-wage economy, attracted by those high wages. That would cause labor supply to move out in that economy, and the real wage would fall. And if labor was completely free to move, and if all workers cared about was the level of their wage, then this process would continue until wages were perfectly equalized. Now, of course, there are lots of restrictions to the movement of labor across international borders, and there are lots of things that workers care about beyond their wage. But the underlying insight is still an important one. Differential wages will tend to induce migration, and migration will be a force that will tend to bring real wages in line across countries. What about physical capital? By physical capital, we mean machinery, buildings, vehicles that firms own, and the like. Now, the definition of a capital good is that it's a good that's used in the production of other goods, but it is not completely exhausted in the production process. And that's what differentiates a capital good from an intermediate input. at any given time, the economy as a whole has a stock of physical capital. And this stock evolves over time. And the two things that cause the stock of physical capital to change over time are depreciation and new investment. So if we start with an initial capital stock, one of the things that will happen is that some of it will wear out over time. Buildings will fall down, computers will become obsolete, and so forth. But at the same time, firms engage in new investment, buying new machinery, building new factories. All of this pushes up the capital stock. The net effect of these two things gives us the capital stock at the end of the year. So, in the end, as long as new investment is greater than depreciation, the capital stock next year will be greater than the capital stock that we started off with. And the investment comes from, as we've seen before, comes from the saving of households and potentially the borrowing from abroad. That is a flow into the financial markets. If the government is borrowing, some of that money flows out of the financial markets, and whatever is left over is what we call investment. So one definition of investment, an accounting definition, is that it's equal to national saving being the sum of private saving and the saving or borrowing of the government, and then we add borrowing from abroad. As we've just seen, the capital stock changes because of investment and depreciation, and capital, like labor, will also go in search of high returns. So even though firms can't actually physically move factories from one country to another, they can certainly make decisions about the location of new investment that will be based on the returns that they perceive to that investment. So capital, like labor, goes in search of high returns, and that, interestingly, is also a force that tends to equalize wages. Because if capital goes to a country where labor is relatively abundant, which is something that's likely to happen because labor will be cheap there, then one of the effects will be to raise the productivity of labor and therefore to raise wages. What about human capital? Human capital refers to the skills of the workforce, and human capital is therefore changed whenever workers are trained, whenever the economy as a whole educates its children and educates its workers, and also whenever skilled workers migrate into or out of an economy. And incoming migration of skilled workers will, of course, tend to raise human capital in an economy. If we have a so-called brain drain where skilled workers move out, that will tend to decrease human capital in an economy. The other three inputs, it's a little harder for us to talk about in great detail because they're harder to measure. So we tend to group them together into something we call technology. So technology consists of the knowledge we have in an economy, the natural resources we have in an economy, and the social infrastructure. When we think about knowledge, we're thinking about basic knowledge, things like calculus, things like the formula for Coca-Cola, and so forth. Knowledge changes in an economy over time by technology transfer. So one of the ways in which developing economies are able to become richer is by importing state-of-the-art technologies from developed economies. And knowledge also increases when we have invention and innovation. So when we come up with new ways of doing things, when we come up with new processes, and so forth. Natural resources are pretty self-explanatory. Natural resources tend to decline as we use up our stocks of resources, although of course resource discoveries also increase the effective natural resources that we have in an economy. And social infrastructure is the catch-all term for everything else. It really refers to how good a place an economy is to carry out a business. And that depends on things like institutions, legal institutions, protection of property rights, ability to write contracts, and so on and so forth. The last point I'd want to make is that all of these different inputs can change both in the relatively short run, by which I mean kind of a period of a few months, in the longer run, thinking in terms of years, and in the very long run, thinking in terms of decades. So if we ask what will move real GDP around in the short run, That's going to be things like changes in the demand for labor, leading to the hiring and firing of workers, and changes in the utilization of capital. As we start to move out into slightly longer time horizons, labor supply begins to become more important. Decisions about hours worked, decisions about participation in the labor force, labor training begins to become important. Transfer of technology begins to become important. Over even longer time horizons, we start to think about the mobility of capital across countries. We start to think about the movement of labor across countries. And as we start moving to the very long run, then the overall accumulation of capital becomes important. Inventions and innovations become important. Population growth starts to play a role, demographic change, education, and so forth. And some things really only have an impact, a significant impact in GDP over very long time horizons. And there we would point to improved institutions, decline in natural resources, and so forth. So the underlying idea is that if we can think about the factors that change the different inputs into the production function, then we can explain how real GDP changes over time.